To celebrate National Hispanic Heritage Month, the Conservative Hispanic Society would like to tell you a story. A story about a man that you've probably never even heard of. His name, Master Sergeant Roy P. Benavidez. He was the son of a Texas sharecropper. He was abandoned at the age of 10. He only attained a 7th grade education, and because of that fact, Mr. Benavidez endured insults that were tantamount to calling him a dumb Mexican. Well, he was anything but that. He was intelligent and patriotic, too. In fact, President Ronald Reagan said this about Benavidez, quote, "If the story of his heroism were a movie script, you would not believe it," end quote. Get us out of here, for God's sake! Get us out! The year was 1968, the Vietnam War. A Green Beret outpost puts out a call for help. A 12-man patrol was surrounded by a North Vietnamese battalion. Armed with only a knife and a medical bag, Master Sergeant Roy P. Benavidez rushed aboard a helicopter with a crew of 3 to go rescue his comrades. The landing area, well, it was hot. The copter had to hover 10 feet above the ground and about a football field's length away from where the bullets were flying, so Roy simply jumped out. He was shot the minute he hit the ground, but he kept on moving. A grenade tore into his flesh, in his neck, and in his face, but he kept on moving. When he arrived at where the Americans were hunkered down, he found 4 men dead. The rest were badly hurt. Roy got to work right away. He distributed ammunition, began to treat the wounded, and started calling in airstrikes. He was then shot again. He ordered the chopper to come in closer, and then he began to drag the dead and wounded toward that aircraft. Once all were on board, he headed back to get classified documents. While he was running back toward the chopper, he was hit again in the stomach, and then a grenade sent hot chunks of metal into his back. Well, he made it back to the chopper. Then the rotor started to thunder faster and faster, and the metal bird began to take flight. But as we mentioned, the bullets were flying around, and they continued to fly and struck the pilot, sending that chopper crashing back to Earth. Roy began to make a defensive perimeter. He started once again calling in airstrikes, and he called for a replacement helicopter and started unloading all the soldiers he had just loaded minutes before. Through it all, Roy Benavidez urged his fellow Americans to fight on. During the time it took to get the new evac chopper on the scene, Roy was shot several more times. Finally, the new helicopter arrived, and Roy began to load the men once again. As the men were starting to load, a North Vietnamese soldier charged Roy's position. The soldier clubbed Benavidez and stabbed him with his bayonet. With his jaw broken and a deep wound from the bayonet, Roy managed to unsheath his knife and kill his attacker. As Benavidez loaded the last man onto the aircraft, 2 more Vietnamese soldiers came charging out of the jungle, so Roy grabbed his rifle and shot them both dead. Roy stood as sentry, and not until all wounded were aboard did Benavidez allow himself to be pulled aboard that escaping helicopter. The ride back to the base was an agonizing 20 minutes. Blood poured out of the helicopter as Roy held in his own intestines with his bare hands. By the time the chopper landed, Army medics triaged the wounded and placed Benavidez among the dead. As the doctor tried to zip up the body bag, Benavidez spit in his face. It was the only thing he had the strength to do. Roy spent a year recovering from his extensive wounds. After all of this, it took 13 years for Roy Benavidez to receive recognition for his heroic deeds that day in Vietnam. Benavidez received the Medal of Honor. But 2 years later, the Social Security Administration tried to stop payments he had been receiving since retiring from the Army. Roy still had shrapnel in his body and lived in constant pain from his injuries. President Ronald Reagan intervened, and this American hero's benefits were restored. The Navy even took the unprecedented act of naming one of their ships after this enlisted man, Master Sergeant Roy P. Benavidez. U.S. Special Forces, they're rumored to have a phrase that is spoken when courage needs to be summoned. Tango Mike, Mike. Tango Mike, Mike. That was Roy's call sign. Not bad for a man that some in our society called a stupid Mexican. Oh, and what was the fate of those that were rescued that day? All 8 men lived.